I won't blame you if you listen to this gospel and say hectic. So I want to place our reading from the Gospel of Mark this morning in some context. So we've been journeying with Jesus and his disciples from the moment that he's finished his public ministry in the area of Galilee. He's turned his face towards Jerusalem. And he has been telling them, and it's the third time he's told them now, the events that will unfold when he reaches Jerusalem. That he will be given up to the powers that be, and that he will be crucified, he will die, and he will be risen again. And this teaching is very difficult for the disciples. And one of the things I love about the Gospel of Mark is that it's generally it doesn't put the disciples in a very good light. Generally, we find in the Gospel of Mark that the disciples misunderstand Jesus, that they don't get what he's saying. So the first time, you'll remember a couple of weeks ago, when Jesus told them that he was going to die in Jerusalem, Peter said, no, it cannot be that way. And Jesus answered him and said, get thee behind me, Satan, for you mind the things of the world and not things of God. And then last week we heard that the disciples were murmuring amongst themselves, saying, who will be the greatest among us? Who of us who are in this inner circle of this Messiah, which one of us is going to have the most prestige? And Jesus again rebukes them and says, no, the first must be last, because the Messiah has come not to be served, but to be the servant of all. And he takes the children and brings the little child and is still in that moment embracing the child. And again they come up with a third thing of, we saw someone casting out demons in your name. And we told them to stop. And again Jesus is like, guys, you are not getting the point. Whoever is not against us is for us. They don't have to belong to the small elite group. If they are doing something in my name, if they believe in me. And so Jesus is constantly grappling with his disciples' expectations of him, of who this God is supposed to be. And Jesus in the Gospel of Mark is constantly coming back at them and saying, I'm turning the whole social order on its head. I'm not that Messiah that you are expecting. I have come to be the servant of all. I'm talking about a God that you need to draw close to, a God who is inclusive, a God who cares for the little ones and the vulnerable. And so it gives me hope when I read that these disciples who literally for 3 years walked with Jesus, ate, slept, listened to every sermon he gave, just couldn't grasp the enormity of this controversial and mysterious God. Because we as disciples are also called to grapple with this God. And I think what we see in the scriptures today is Jesus opening that space for us. That each one of us needs to grapple with, who is this God to us? What is our image of God? What is our expectation of God? And so when it comes to the cutting off and the plucking out, please, we're Anglican, okay? We are Anglican. So we read this in the context of the Gospel of Mark, saying he did not speak to them except in parables. So Jesus was using shock therapy at this point. I think he was maybe frustrated. I would be feeling a little frustrated with my disciples who were not getting the point. And so he uses this as shock therapy, or for shock value. But what he's really talking about, he's saying there are things that will cause you to stumble, places that you must not walk, things that you must not reach and want, and your eyes must not be filled with envy or with strife, but you need to be at peace with one another. There are things in your life as a believer, Jesus is saying, in my life as a believer, that will cause me to stumble in my understanding of who God is. And those things are very dangerous to us, and we have to take them seriously, and we have to confront them. And Jesus is also saying there are things that you must not do to make your brother or your sister stumble. So in the way that we grapple with God, in the way that we work with God, we have to be alive to the many ways in which we will miss the mark, where we will be like these disciples. Like I say, Peter is always my favorite one. You know, this rock on which the church is built is always missing the point. Then we have Thomas, who, you know, is that doubting Thomas. It's a wonderful invitation that God gives us in the scriptures to say, you need to journey with me. And so Jesus this morning is saying, I am a God who cares for the lowest among you, who cares for the vulnerable, who cares for the outcast, who seeks to meet you in the depth of your need for me. And we read in the Old Testament, in the book of Esther. I'm not going to pray on Esther, that's a whole nother sermon. Okay? Esther is a very problematic book. So I'm just going to pick something there and say, in Esther what we see is the most marginalized. She's an orphan, and she's a woman, and she's a Jew under a Persian Empire. And yet God finds a way to use her to transform the circumstance or the situation. In a time when King Xerxes, another very problematic leader, so we won't go into that. But I think it's an example in Scripture where God is able and tries and works with our deepest vulnerabilities and our deepest exclusions to bring transformation. But it's really the letter of James that I think, for me, gives me a way forward in this week. So Jesus calls us to really grapple with our own images of God. Who do we think this God is? Is this God an old man with a beard sitting up somewhere with a big stick in his hand, watching us and just waiting for you to slip up so that he can whack you? Is that our image of God? Many of us as children in Sunday school, not in this one, Natasha, not in our Sunday school, but in Sunday school, as parents will tell, God is watching. God is watching you. Must be careful, you'll go to hell. Do we still have that image of God? When Jesus is trying to reveal to us a very different nature to God. And so, for each one of us, James is saying, the key is prayer. Because prayer, the power of prayer is that prayer is an encounter with God. And so as we are a community journeying together through this thing called life, where we have sickness and we have ways in which we stumble and ways in which we sin and problems that we're facing, that as a community, we need to be prayerful. And as individuals, we need this encounter with God. Because the only way to really come to know who God is to spend time with God. And so James is encouraging us this morning to say, in order to know who this God is and what this God seeks to do in your circumstance, in your life, as a community and as individuals, you need to spend time in prayer. Now, the beautiful thing about prayer is there's lots of different ways to pray. There's lots of different types of prayer. And some of us are in constant conversation with God. I don't know about you, but when I'm driving and the taxi driver comes and cuts me off, my first response is, oh, sweet Jesus, check your people. So some of us are in constant communication. For some of us, it's a different type of prayer. But prayer is more than us just talking at God, saying, hey God, I've got this problem, and I'd really appreciate it if you could sort it out. Lord, this month my finances, they're looking very bad, so please, Father, I'm leaving them with you. And then the next day coming back and saying, Lord, you haven't done anything yet, am I still on your list? So prayer is not just about making our petitions to God. We do need to make our petitions to God. We must open our lives to God. We must be in intimate conversation with God. But we also need a time of listening to God, a time of slowing down and quieting ourselves, where we have no agenda except just to sit in the presence of God, just to seek to be close. Not because we need we can start by saying all that and then eventually say like, okay, Lord, now I've gotten everything off my agenda. Maybe we can just sit together as friends. You know those people that you don't need to talk, when you can just be in the same space and just enjoy each other's quiet company so that God can reveal God's self to you in that moment. And so I'd like to end with an invitation to each one of us to practice this week. I'm doing a course right now called Ignatian and Encounters with God. And one of the things we looked at last week was the prayer of the presence of God. How do we become more aware that God is actually present, that God is with us, that God's Spirit is in us and around us? And so the way we do it is set a timer. That's the first thing. Otherwise your brain is always going to be asking yourself, you know, am I taking too long or am I taking too little? So set a timer. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Some of us have more time than others. Set a timer. Take a moment. Pay attention to your breathing. Just notice your breath. Notice any sounds around you. And then just let them go and become present to the moment. And then imagine God gazing at you. Now for some people, imagining God looking at me or gazing at me might be difficult. So you can also just imagine a warm blanket or shawl being placed around you. And just breathe into it. God gazing at me and me gazing at God. God gazing at me and me gazing at God. I believe that this is the encounter that Jesus will help us deal with the things that he talks about this morning. God will gently unveil to us those things in our lives or those things in the way in which we interact with others that may be causing us to stumble in our understanding of who God really is. And so my prayer for each one of us this week is that we will really go into this week with a determination to become more conscious of God's presence in and around us, so that God may work a transformation in us, not necessarily in our circumstances, but in us, so that God may powerfully use us to whichever purpose is his agenda for that moment. In the name